Oh, all right. It's the top of the hour, so I just want to kick things off. Thank you, everyone who came here early. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. This is the second session of Mishnah in Depth, Sanhedrin, and Makkot with Rabbi Matthew Nitzanim. This class and our entire Mishnah in Depth series is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. We are picking up Sanhedrin with a newish teacher, Rabbi Nitzanim. He is a teacher at Midrashet Amudin in Yerushalayim. He studied at Bar Ilan, Princeton, and Penn, and received smicha from the Israeli chief rabbinate. This class is intended to be an anchor and support to your own individual learning of Mishnah Yomit, and is assuming that you have been reviewing each day's 1 to 2 mishnayot on your own, and we are now coming together to look at them together. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Nitzanim.
Fantastic. Kayla, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining in today for our learning. Looking at chapters 2 and 3 of Masechet Sanhedrin in the Mishnah. Even before getting started, just as to sort of bring it all together, Kayla spoke to the fact that our shiur now is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Memorial Learning through Drisha of Mishnah, and it's today's a special day when Rivka's daughter Miriam is getting married, and we want to hold that celebration with us as we go into our learning together today. All right, I'm going to put the slides up so we can see all together. If I could just get some thumbs up. 1 second. If I get a thumbs up, confirming that you can see my slides on your screen.
Yep, I can see.
Fantastic. All right, so then here we are. We're in our second shiur of Mishnah Sanhedrin with me. All right, I want to just overview what we're going to be doing today. I want to first just spend a little bit of time reviewing what hopefully everyone had the opportunity to see during your learning in chapters 2 and 3 of the Mishnah. Just make sure we're sort of leveling the playing field, that we remember the material. And then there are really 2 topics I want to explore. One is Rabbi Yehuda, one of the Tanaim who appears in our mishnayot, and his approach to gainful employment. He cares a great deal about work, and this shows up in our Mishnah. And the other is this concept Gzirat HaKatuv, which doesn't appear in our Mishnah, but it does appear in the Gemara's discussion of an element of our Mishnah, and has some sort of far-reaching implications of how we think about halacha and Torah, sort of anchored in the Mishnah that we saw this week. Before we'll finish off with a preview to things to be on the lookout for in your learning this coming week. All right, here we go. So some review. Chapter 2, Parak Bet of Masechet Sanhedrin, opens with a compare-contrast of the roles, functions of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and the Melech, the king. Particularly in the context of the court, meaning how they would stand before court, whether they could participate in judicial proceedings, and then there's a bit of some sort of tangenting that happens to discuss a couple rules about the Kohen Gadol, and then even at greater length about the king. As a Hanukkah tie-in, and wishing everybody a happy Hanukkah, there's something fitting about thinking about Chazal's approach to the positions of Kohen Gadol and Melech, of the high priest and the king. And that as is seen fairly clearly in the Mishnah that we would have seen this week, the rabbis think of both of these roles as very distinct from one another. They have different sort of roles in society, and hence different in Jewish society, and different rules that govern what they can and can't do, in particular in relationship to the adjudication of and legislation of the law. This is very telling because it is in line with the rabbinic critique of the Maccabees. Chazal were not especially fond of the Hasmonean dynasty, in part at least because they were a family of Kohanim who sort of retained control of the Kihuna Gedolah, of the priesthood, and also functioned as monarchs. And Chazal were troubled by this, and it colors how they sort of look at the story of the Maccabees and how they tell that story in the context of thinking about Hanukkah. And so it sort of ties in nicely to take this moment on Hanukkah to see how Chazal really want to see these roles separated out and distinguished one from the other. I also want to note that at the very end, I'm sorry, at the bottom of this list, we'll notice that the Mishnah teaches us that the Kohen Gadol has constraints on his performance of yibum, levirate marriage, meaning in a situation in which the Kohen Gadol were to have a brother who married and then died before having children, that in theory the brother is meant to perform yibum for his deceased brother's wife, now widow, and the Kohen Gadol does not perform yibum. There are some constraints on the Kohen Gadol, as stated in Sefer Vayikra. And there are also some rules about how he grieves in the event that that the Kohen Gadol experiences the loss of a loved one. But what's striking is that when it comes to the context in which we're talking about the Kohen Gadol is previously in the first chapter, we were introduced to the different kinds of batei din, the different kinds of courts. And here we want to talk about the Kohen Gadol in the court. And yet there is actually nothing that is unique about the Kohen Gadol in the court. Right, we go through the list. Kohen Gadol is allowed to judge, is allowed to be judged, can testify, can be testified against. There's nothing different about the Kohen Gadol. What is different, as we saw last week, is that the Kohen Gadol, when facing a trial, needs to be brought before the Sanhedrin, the Beit Din Gadol, right, the Sanhedrin of 71, but otherwise can sort of function normally within the judicial system, as opposed to the king, who may not do any of these things. And if we're going to read the Mishnah somewhat literarily, it's very striking that we sort of contrast the Kohen Gadol and the Melech. The Kohen Gadol is kind of seen as sort of a normal citizen. As in some ways, the presentation of the rules of the Kohen Gadol is really just a foil for the king, whom Chazal want to make as clear as possible, unlike the Kohen Gadol, who may have nothing to do with what happens in the courts, cannot be a judge, cannot be judged, cannot testify, and cannot be testified against. That we want to keep the Melech, the king, as far away from the Sanhedrin as possible. Now, this is striking because in Tehillim and elsewhere in Tanakh, there's a clear indication that the king is meant to have some sort of function as a judge, engaging in judgment. Perhaps the clearest example we have, do we have a story? We're throwing this one out to the crowd, a story in Tanakh about a king who judges a case. A case is brought before the king. Yeah, Andrew.
We have a couple of stories with Shlomo, and then we also have an idea that David was doing dinim with Nida as well.
Yeah, so there's this language that appears in Sefer Shmuel, and then it's sort of implied in Tehillim that David was oseh mishpat u'tzedakah, he's dealing with judgment, and Chazal claim that the particular cases he's working on relate to Dam Nidan, actually questions around fetal status in cases of stillbirth. Why exactly David is dealing with that is a story to unpack another time. But yeah, Shlomo has his story, right? Mishpat Shlomo, where these two women come, and there's the question of the baby, who takes the baby home. It's clear that in Tanakh, the king is seen as having some sort of role in terms of adjudicating cases, and it's striking that Chazal really want to keep the king away from the Sanhedrin, and a sort of stronger separation of powers. Not entirely, there's some places where they interact, but on the whole, they're really separate institutions in a way that Tanakh isn't necessarily operating under those terms. I think I saw Nathan. Did you have a hand? Okay, great. Andrew.
So I mean, even in the very next Mishnah,
Mhm.
it's like I found it confusing because it says at the end of Mishnah Daled that when the king is Yoshev Badin, that the Sefer Torah needs to be with him. But we said that he isn't done and he's not done. Like he's not judged nor does he judge. So what the exact next Mishnah is just saying he brings the Sefer Torah to him in a case of din. So what is that referring to?
Fantastic. I'm glad that you noticed it, Andrew. There's this odd thing we see. I can't really put the text on the screen right now, but yes, it says later on in the parak that the king is meant to have a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll with him at all times, including when he is, as Andrew said, Yoshev Badin, sitting in judgment. But the king shouldn't be sitting in judgment. The traditional commentaries try to claim that Yoshev Badin is just a turn of phrase. It means when he's sort of holding court, right? He's sitting with ministers and other folks, doing monarch-y stuff. I'm not necessarily sitting in the position of a judge. Though there is some academic work that suggests that maybe there are different strands in the Mishnah reflecting different sort of positions, and that there was a strand that presumed that the king could have some role in judgment. though it's hard to really demonstrate that definitively. But there is something peculiar there about the king and judgment. Having mentioned also on this note, the second parak goes on to talk about the powers of the king. There isn't really another place in the Mishnah to put that, so it becomes a tangent that makes up a lot of the second parak. And just to briefly review, the Torah, the Mishnah states that the king's primary sort of authority has to do with war powers, the authority to declare war, though in theory still needs to get the approval of the Beit Din Gadol, of the Sanhedrin. And relatedly is the king's power of eminent domain, of the authority to seize property, seemingly only for the purposes of waging war. Though there's some ambiguity about exactly how exactly that gets applied. What are the constraints, if any, on the power of eminent domain for the king? And then there are these constraints on the king, which are stated in the Torah. They appear in Sefer Devarim, in Parshat Shoftim. That there are three things the king, a Jewish king, may not have too many of. Can't have too many wives, can't have too many horses, and can't have too much money. And so this is stipulated in the Mishnah. Maybe a little bit later on, we'll talk a little bit about some of the interesting formulation there that the Mishnah uses. And then, yes, this obligation to have a Torah scroll by his side at all times. And then closes with the obligation of the people to honor the king. I want to take note of this guy for the art history folks out there. This is, you can shout it out.
Michelangelo's
right.
David.
Thank you. This is Michelangelo's David. We only got his head this time, but I just want to take a moment to note that going through these mishnayot, you may notice that there were 3 references to King David, either explicit or implied. And there's even more of this in the Gemara. It's very telling that the rabbis, when they're writing or sort of formulating these mishnayot, there is no Jewish king. In all likelihood, it could be that, again, the earliest sort of the project of formulating the Mishnah, where the earliest of the Tanaim live, not so long after the Hasmoneans, so maybe they saw a Jewish king, but presumably most of the folks writing in the Mishnah have never met a Jewish king, never seen one, and they're imagining what it ought to be like. And when they're imagining what a Jewish king ought to be like, they're taking King David HaMelech, as their framing, which is fitting because there are a lot of kings as we're told in Sefer Melachim, who weren't so great and got things wrong. And it's really interesting that when trying to determine rules about the rules that govern the kings, the rabbis see David HaMelech as sufficient proof of what a king ought to be, which is why there are these repeated references to David HaMelech. Just something sort of beneath the surface in our Mishnayot. Okay, and a word about the third parak, which also hopefully folks had a chance to see this past week. We start with those who are disqualified from testifying. Right, we're shifting to the role of testimony in the court in Beit Din. So those who are disqualified from testifying, the psulei idut. There's some ambiguity in the Mishnayot, which the Gemara picks up on. Are there distinctions between who is pasula idut, who is disqualified from testifying, versus who is pasula ladun, who is disqualified from being a judge? It's not so clear from the Mishnah which of these categories has to do with testifying only or also to judging. But certainly regarding testifying, if you are, we'll use the term financially suspect for now. We're going to see that Mishnah in greater detail in just a moment. But if you're someone who can't be trusted with money, then you can't testify. Why is that? Feel free to call out.
Because you can be bribed.
Exactly. The Torah is very concerned about bribing. It shows up multiple times in the Torah, the prohibition of bribes, because the rabbinic judicial system relies very heavily on trusting our witnesses, right? As opposed to other systems of law where we don't have a high threshold for testifying, but all testimony can be questioned, right? You don't have to adhere to testimony. In the rabbinic system, we have a high bar that needs to be passed for testimony to be accepted by the court. But once testimony has been accepted, no ruling can be made that is in contradiction to what the testimony stated. And we commit ourselves to the testimony, so we have to trust the witnesses. If you're someone who we suspect could be open to being bribed, then your testimony is disqualified. And also on the list are relatives. We'll talk a bit more about them a little later on. But yeah, relatives are disqualified from testifying, as well as besties. The term in the Mishnah is an ohev, someone who, your friend, someone who's close to you. There's some puzzling through what exactly counts as a friend who's good enough that they'd be disqualified, and similarly, enemies, a soneh, someone that hates you or that you hate. We're also worried about lying. And then the parak closes with some procedural rules regarding, procedural rules about what cross-examination looks like, how the witnesses would be questioned, the rules around deliberative secrecy, and it's very important to the Mishnah, to Chazal, that judges are never expected to share how they voted individually, but rather the court offers a shared ruling in the name of the entirety of the court. It's considered a broaching of the prohibition of rechilut, of gossip, for an individual judge to share how they ruled individually in the voting, which I think ties in nicely to what we saw last week, that we have this concern for public trust in the Beit Din, as we saw last time in terms of how voting works, where we don't want there to be we don't want there to be people who are involved in a case who have hard feelings towards an individual judge. In order to protect against that, the Mishnah insists there has to be deliberative secrecy. We never find out who voted which way. And finally, the question of statute of limitations. Is there a point at which a case cannot be, in this context, revisited rather than raised for the first time, with Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel ruling, and this is how the halachas determined in the end, that there's really, in a sense, no statute of limitations. The Mishnah thinks that as long as you have new evidence, you can always revisit a case, as long as you can demonstrate why you weren't able to bring that evidence earlier on. That's review. Any, at this point, questions, comments, concerns, things that came up either just now in our review or from your own learning, things that were of interest to you from chapters 2 and 3 before we do some of our deep dive. Yeah, Caleb, was that a hand?
Yes, under the financially suspect, does that include, is the assumption that gamblers are puzzled from testifying come from the same suspicions as bribery, or does it come from something else?
I'm bracketing the question. We're going to get back to it in just a moment.
That's okay. I'll sit tight.
Fantastic. All right. Okay, so we're going to move ahead. And I want to start with this question about Rabbi Yehuda on work. So here's the Mishnah that we were talking about the financially suspect folks. We can go through that together. Ve'eloheina psulim. These are they who are disqualified. 4 categories: hamasachik b'kuvia, one who plays with cubes. This seems to be some form of gambling. Hamalved b'ribit, someone who loans on interest, a kind of thing that happens all the time with a economic system in which we live, but certainly in the time of the Mishnah was pretty much frowned upon, and the Torah frowns upon it. Mafrichei yonim, those are engaged in dove racing, also a form of gambling, and sochari shavi, those who sell produce from the Shemitah year. Meaning, in theory, during the Shemitah year, all produce in the land of Israel is meant to be hefker, ownerless, but folks would go gather it up, have a whole warehouse of produce, and then start selling it for profit. So any of those people who are engaged in these behaviors, they're considered disqualified. Now comes Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, ematai. Says Rabbi Yehuda, ematai. When is this the case? I'm pausing. Just on that word ematai, it should be noted that the Gemara discusses in a couple of places. There's a sort of an ongoing machloket. There are all sorts of mishnayot where the Tana Kama, the opening Tana, will state a rule, and Rabbi Yehuda will come in and say, the next line will be Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, ematai. When is this the case? And then we'll put some sort of caveat that constrain the ruling of the Tana Kama to a particular case. And it is a machloket in the Gemara. When Rabbi Yehuda does this, is he challenging the Tana Kama? Meaning we should presume that the Tana Kama is stating a different position from Rabbi Yehuda? Or should we presume that Rabbi Yehuda is simply coming to clarify what the Tana Kama was attempting to say? And it can be hard to tell from one case to another. So I just want to note that there's ambiguity, and the Gemara is aware of this ambiguity. Is Rabbi Yehuda coming to clarify or to challenge what has been said thus far? Okay, back into Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda steps in and says, Eimatai, when is it the case that those people who engage in financially suspect activities are disqualified from testifying? Bizman she'im lehem umanut elahi. It's only for people who have no other trade. And umanut here, in modern Hebrew, umanut is the arts, but we're thinking maybe less art and more artisan. Umanut here is used as meaning a craft or a trade, some sort of a gainful employment, something you're doing that earns you money. Aval, says Rabbi Yehuda, aval yesh lehan umanut shelohi ksherin. If you have some other job, then you're fine. Okay. What is Rabbi Yehuda trying to get at here? Why does Rabbi Yehuda think that it helps if you have a job?
Because if you have a job, you don't depend on this for living, so you're not doing it for that reason. You're doing it because of some supposedly not out of need, out of belief.
It sounds like that's what's happening here, exactly, where Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, our concern is, are you the kind of person who can be easily bribed? But if you're someone who has a job, but you have a vice where you gamble sometimes, we're not so nervous that you're going to take a bribe because you have stable income. You have no particular reason that you need to take a bribe, as opposed to someone who really has just become dependent on these sort of suspect practices where they're really in need of cash and really can be trusted with money. They're in the habit of engaging in behaviors that are, outside of what we would expect of upstanding citizens. That's a person we don't trust. But if you have a job, you're okay. It sounds like that's what's going on. Kayla is right to note that the Gemara is not entirely sure that's what's happening here. And it produces this machloket, whether misachek b'kubiyah, in particular, whether gambling is a self-standing prohibition. It is prohibited to gamble, and if you do so, it's a form of theft. And therefore you can't be trusted. You have the status of a rasha. You're not a full-fledged citizen. You can't testify. Or is it we just have this concern: are you easily bribed or not? And hence, with Rabbi Yehuda, if you have a job, you're fine. Interestingly, this machloket in the Gemara, whether misachek b'kubiyah, whether gambling is a self-standing prohibition, a form of theft, or is just a practice that makes you suspicious, but as long as you have a job, you can still testify, which in the nafkamina, right, the practical implication of that question is gambling permitted or prohibited according to the Mishnah? It's unclear from the Gemara what the conclusion is, and it comes out a machloket between, broadly speaking, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. The Balei Tosfot in the name of Ashkenaz sort of go one way, and the Rambam in the name of Sfaradim, or Sfaradim following the Rambam, I should say, go the other. And so there's machloket even today whether gambling should be considered prohibited or not. But that's, in terms of our Mishnah, my hunch is to say, just reading the Mishnah, that even though the Gemara entertains the possibility that Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing with the Tanakama, meaning Tanakama thinks there is some self-standing concern about gambling. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, as long as you have a job, you're fine. My gut tells me that Rabbi Yehuda is really just coming to clarify. Rabbi Yehuda really is going to say, Tanakama, you agree with me. Our whole concern is, are you the kind of person who will easily take a bribe? If you have a job, we're not worried about that. But what I want to take a moment to focus on is less about this question of bribes and more about the figure Rabbi Yehuda. I want to take a moment to, as we go through our study of Mishnah together, hopefully we'll take advantage of different kinds of tools we can use towards our study of Mishnah. And one of them that I want to take a look at today is trying to study a character, a figure who appears in the Mishnah, and see if we can work out some sort of coherent approach to how they think about an issue writ large. We've met Rabbi Yehuda, and as we've seen, he clearly thinks that people who have jobs can be trusted. Meaning, at least we don't think that even if you're someone who gambles, if you're someone who has a job, you broadly speaking are probably an upstanding citizen. You're going to be okay. We can trust you. This is actually fairly consistent with other teachings we know from Rabbi Yehuda. You can enjoy the picture of the grave of Rabbi Yehuda. His father's name was Eli, so he's occasionally referred to as Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. His kever, which is supposedly in the northern part of Israel. How they know it's his, your guess is as good as mine. So we know in the Gemara in Kiddushin, Rabbi Yehuda is quoted as saying, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, right, in Masechet Kiddushin, by way of background, there's the discussion of the obligations that parents have towards their children and also children towards their parents. right? The obligation to, when relevant, perform circumcision, redeem a child, teach them Torah, and so on. And Rabbi Yehuda is the one who pops in and says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer kol she'ino melamed et beno umanut. There we have that term again, umanut, a trade or a craft. Melamdo listut. Says Rabbi Yehuda, any parent who fails to train their child in some sort of craft has essentially taught them listut, something like thievery, I suppose we would say, where you'll end up a thug. Rabbi Yehuda is someone who thinks that it's extremely important to teach your children a trade so that you won't find yourself engaged in financially suspect or even forbidden or dangerous behaviors. Right, so Rabbi Yehuda thinks it's very important to make sure that people are traded in a craft. And similarly in Masechet Nedarim, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Gedola Melacha Shemechabedet et Be'aleha. Great is work, for it brings honor to those who do it. Rabbi Yehuda clearly has sort of this positive feeling around having a job, getting work done. In a somewhat more theological tone, the source on the bottom of the screen from Masechet Brachot, Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli. So this teaching that is passed down over a few generations, tracing back to Rabbi Yehuda. Bo urei shelo kedorot harishonim, dorot ha'achronim. Look and see how the earlier generations are not like the later generations. Dorot harishonim asu toratan keva umelachtan arai zo v'zo nitkayma biyadan. He says back in the old day, I think he means, I don't know if he means scholars specifically or maybe Jews generally, would make their Torah the essence of what they did, and seemingly a good chunk of their time, their study of Torah, and their malacha and their work, they do a little bit of that, and they manage to successfully do both. But dorot ha'achronim shasu melachtan keva v'toratan arai, but the later generations who put all their energy into their work and didn't take their Torah seriously, zo v'zo lo nitkayma biyadan. They didn't manage to do either. All right, so Rabbi Yehuda is really interested in finding how can we manage to accomplish both serious Torah study and get our work done, and finding a way to accomplish both of those is really important to him. And he's troubled by those who don't manage to balance those two things well together. One more teaching from Rabbi Yehuda, just to sort of fill out the picture, a story from Masechet Shabbat. Why we're talking? Why is Rabbi Yehuda? The question is asked: why is Rabbi Yehuda referred in elsewhere in the Gemara as Rosh Hamedarim Mechol Makom, the first person to speak? And here we tell a story. Diyatve Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, V'yativ Yehuda ben Girin Gabayu. There are three rabbis who are sitting together in a circle: Rabbi Yehuda, our guy, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon, who is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He'll end up in a cave by the end of the story, so stay tuned. And another figure by the name of Yehuda ben Girin who's with them. And Rabbi Yehuda opens up the conversation. Patach Rabbi Yehuda ve'amar, kama na'im ma'asehen shalu ma'zu. Look how wonderful are the deeds, the works of this nation being the Romans. He says, look at the Romans. They get stuff done. Tiknu shvakim, they set up markets. Tiknu ksharim, they built bridges. Tiknu merchzaot, they built bathhouses. Rabbi Yehuda loves the Romans because he's really impressed that they are great at architecture, great at urban development. They're invested in what we might call work. Rabbi Yossi shatak. Rabbi Yossi is there and he doesn't want to say anything. Comes in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Na'ana Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai ve'amar, kol ma shetiknu lo tiknu ela letzorech atzman. All that they made, they only made for themselves. Tiknu shvakin lo shiben zonot merchzaot la'aden behen atzman ksharim nitzol mehen mechas. He says the markets are just to have sex workers hanging out there. The bath houses are really just to pleasure themselves. The bridges are just so they can charge a fee. They're not there to help anyone. That's not what they're up to. Halach Yehuda ben Girim Misipir Divrehem. Yehuda ben Girim, who's with them, tells the Roman authorities that what happened. The Romans say, Yehuda she'ilah yitaleh. Yehuda, who spoke nicely about us, we'll give him a raise. We'll take care of him. Yossi sheshatak, Yossi, who's quiet, can go off to Tzipori. And Shimon shegina, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who criticized us, he will be killed. This is the intro to the story about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai running off to the cave. and hiding out there for a couple years with his son before eventually coming out, right? And sort of tied into Lag BaOmer. But the setup here is really important, where we have this opportunity to see that there are those who are really critical, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, of Roman urban development, and Rabbi Yehuda is someone who thinks that there's what to praise in what the Romans were able to accomplish in terms of building, architecture, and so on. And sort of fits well in terms of his general approach and outlook to work. He just thinks it's a good thing, and he values it. And so just seeing this lens as a way to then look back at our Mishnah, when we see that Rabbi Yehuda says, I trust people who work, this is exactly what we would expect Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Eli to say. That because he values people who are employed or doing work, it doesn't surprise us that in our Mishnah he incorporates that in how we think about those are disqualified from testifying. This is just, I think, in terms of our goals for this shiur, a really viable test case for how, by looking at other statements made by the same figure elsewhere in rabbinic writing, that can shed light on what they're saying in a given context. Thoughts, questions, concerns at this point? Saul. Actually, I'm going to stop the share for a moment.
I have a question on the original Mishnah.
Yes.
You talk about the gambling, but the second category is ribbis. So there's no doubt about interest, right? I mean, that's from the Torah. There's no, it doesn't matter what your job is, if you're a banker or a farmer, but if you charge interest, your testimony isn't good. So why isn't there a logic within the Mishnah as opposed to separating it out?
Number one, a really valuable question to note that these cases are different from each other, right? Where Misachai B'Kubia is ambiguous, whether it's actually forbidden or just frowned upon, but Mavet B'Ribit, lending on interest, is clearly forbidden. So good a question, in fact, that the Talmud asks it. And if you were to see in the third chapter in the Gemara, I'm blanking on, I think it's Rav Chisda, I haven't seen it in a while, but the Gemara asks exactly this question. What is the relation between these two cases? We basically have two directions we could take, right? Either we can say, it must be that all of these, that in as much as Maved B'Ribit, lending on interest, is forbidden, then it must be that all four cases there are things which are on their own forbidden, and hence it must be that gambling is forbidden as well. Alternatively, we could say, our Mishnah is not interested in the question of what is forbidden. Our Mishnah is interested in the question of who is disqualified from testifying. And so there are ways to be disqualified from testifying that involve doing forbidden behaviors. There are ways to be disqualified from testifying based on doing sketchy behavior, engaging in sketchy behavior. But the fact that some are strictly forbidden and some are not isn't a distinction we need to pay. It doesn't have bearing on our question regarding disqualification. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Other thoughts, questions, concerns at this point, this juncture? Great. All right. So, oh yes, Nathan.
Sorry, so what's a long tradition, several generations later, was that sort of an outlier? I missed exactly what you commented on that.
The teaching that was passed down from Rabbi Yehuda about the Dor Rishonim, Dor Achronim, the early and later generations. Yeah, so it seems telling that in some sense there's just a nice literary piece, right, where Rabbi Bar Chana quotes Rabbi Yochanan, who quotes Rabbi Yehuda, who says, I remember what it was like in the olden days. And so even wonder where there's that's meant to just sort of highlight the point that there's this shift over the course of time between a moment, whether real or imagined, in Jewish history, where people managed to do lots of Torah study, a little bit of work, but they successfully accomplished both, and a time when people did a lot of work, a little Torah study, and did not successfully accomplish either. The fact that there's sort of the generational piece, I suppose, opens up. It could be that there's some real historical shift, though I wonder if there's something imagined happening, right? We're imagining what could have been in the past, right? The fact that we have, a rabbi quoting a rabbi who says what it was a long time ago makes you wonder whether is Rabbi Yehuda talking about something that ever really happened, or what we imagine it must have been like long ago, but it's not clear that it ever really was. Right? In some way, that maybe makes it a deeper reflection on, is it really possible to have meaningful Torah study and meaningful work and really successfully manage both of those? If we want to open up that possibility that maybe we're imagining a plausible past rather than recording what actually happened. Yeah, thanks for bringing that, Nathan. I appreciate it. All right, I'm going to bring the slides back up on the screen. And I want to talk about, as we said before, about Gzerat HaKatuv. I'll just, as a side note, because we mentioned this story from Masechet Shabbat about these three rabbis. For those who want to dive deeper, there's, I think it's the fourth chapter, the third or fourth chapter of Rabbi Abram Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath is an extended reflection on this story, which he thinks is an important lens for thinking about Shabbat and work and productivity. Right, the book The Sabbath is all about what is our relationship with work and productivity, and Heschel has a really interesting reflection on this story and this tension between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Bar Yochai about work and labor. So to explore on your own time, maybe even on Shabbat. All right, I want to talk about in the time that we have left about this term Gzerat HaKatuv. Maybe just by Gzerat HaKatuv. Maybe it's a term that's familiar to some folks from other Jewish learning. I grabbed this definition from Wikipedia. There is a Wikipedia page about the term Gzerat HaKatuv, and let's see what Wikipedia has to say. Gzerat HaKatuv, who Munach hilchati nafutz. It's a common halachic term. Hamita'er halacha odin ma'Torah, that describes a rule from the Torah. She'ein me'acharav higayon barur, that does not have a clear logic to it. I'm skipping the parentheses. V'tokpo mevusas ach v'rak al tzivuy meforash b'mikra. Its authority is based entirely on the fact that it is stated explicitly in the Torah. And this is Wikipedia talking, not me. The term Gzerat HaKatuv, right? Gzera is a decree. Katuv literally means written, or let's say scripture. So the decree of scripture. So Gzerat HaKatuv is, according to Wikipedia, a description of a rule in halacha in the Torah where there's no logic to it. It's just that the Torah says it, so we do it. Okay, here we go. Sentence number 2. Munach ze mehave bitui li'ikaron yesodi batfisa hayehudit orthodoxit. This concept reflects or expresses a fundamental belief in the outlook of Orthodox Judaism. Lefiv tzivuyim mikra'im mechayvim be'ofen a priori, right? That would claim that biblical commands are incumbent upon us, or we are obligated to them in an a priori fashion. Whether or not the rules of the Torah make sense to us, even if they are in contradiction to our own logic. Okay, if in fact Gzerat HaKatuv is a fundamental element of Orthodox Jewish outlook, we should probably figure out what it is. It feels important. And what I'd like to do is call into question Wikipedia's definition of Gzerat HaKatuv. Now, Wikipedia is not my go-to scholar on Judaism, but it's reflective of the fact that many people engaged in traditional Jewish learning think of Gzerat HaKatuv in this way. That when we see in the Gzerat HaKatuv is a term that appears only occasionally in the writing of the Tanaim, but in a number of places in the Gemara and the Talmud, many people take that term to mean it is a thing. The only reason we are expected to follow this rule is because it's stated explicitly in the Torah. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't need to make sense. It shouldn't even make sense. If the Torah said it, we do it. No questions asked. And the question is, why? What is that? Why does it exist? Or why would it exist? When, under what circumstances would the Torah just every now and then say, you know what, guys, this time it doesn't make sense, just do it? Where does that come from? Now, there's an important case. There are all sorts of cases that show up in the Gemara where the term Gzerat HaKatuv is used. But one of them, have a look. This is just one shiur that I found the picture of, but there are many such shiurim. Thinking about Ari Leibowitz here, though there are many versions of the same shiur. I heard it multiple times when I was in yeshiva. The question whether the psul rasha or other psulim, whether the disqualifications in our parak, in our chapter, disqualifications from testifying, are these people disqualified because of a chashash mishaker, out of a concern they're going to lie, or is it a gzeras hakasuv? Is it just because the Torah said so? This is a question that animates much of the traditional discourse around our parak, our chapter, around those who are disqualified from testifying. Are we disqualifying them because we don't trust them, or if they're going to lie, or because the Torah said so? Which again is only a good question if you think there's a difference between something having good reason and the Torah saying so. But that seems to be the starting presumption in quite a lot of Torah discussion around this question. And in particular regarding, what we'll focus on is the case of krovim, of relatives. And this comes from a line that appears not in our Masechah, but in fact in Masechet Bava Batra, but also in a context where it's talking about relatives testifying one for the other. And there's this line in Bava Batra and the Gemara that says, Moshe ve'Aaron lechotna mishum delo mehemneu. Could it be that Moshe and Aharon, right, that Moses and Aaron, the ones from the Torah, those guys, good guys, could it be that they would be disqualified from testifying one for the other, or actually, technically, for their father-in-law? We'll ignore that for now. We'll just use the language of testifying one for the other. Could it be that they can't testify because we don't trust them? They're not mehemne, right? Think of the word ne'eman, right? Trustworthy. So is it because we don't trust them? It can't be. Ela gzerat melechu shelo ya'idu lahem. It's not because we don't trust Moshe and Aaron. It's because it's a gzerat melech, a decree of the king that they can't testify one for the other. I didn't bring all the textual material to back this up, but it's fairly clear that the Gemara uses the terms gzerat melech, decree of the king, and gzerat katuv, decree of the Torah, pretty much interchangeably, which is what leads this is one of many examples. Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg in a shiur has exactly this line: psulo shel karov le'idut, the disqualification of a relative to testify, eino machamat hachashashu meshaker, is not out of concern that they will lie, meaning that your relatives are biased one way or the other. Ella mikoch gzerat hakatuv. It's simply because the Torah said so. Okay, so we're taking as our starting point that there's this language in the Gemara that suggests it, and that people are going to follow in this line of thinking. The problem with relatives is not that we don't trust them, that they're biased. It's because the Torah said so, irrespective of any sort of logic to that. Nathan?
I admit I never learned this before. This is fascinating to me because I can't even think about these rules as applying to Moshe and Aaron, especially because Moshe and Aaron are the children of a aunt and a nephew. And so, yeah, I'd love to learn this Gemara sometime.
So definitely worth seeing the Gemara in Bava Batra, which is dealing with testifying to signatures on a contract, and it takes Moshe and Aaron as an example. Yeah, but there's something funny going on here, where there's this question: what is wrong? How could it be that we don't trust Moshe and Aaron to tell the truth? Right? There are some people who are related to each other, but are so pious or saintly, we would never think they would lie, and yet they're disqualified from testifying one for the other. It must be gzerat hakatuv, which again, according to Wikipedia and many rabbis and Jews out there, we could bring text to back this up. Gzerat hakatuv means it is not because of any sort of reason or logic. They're just disqualified, right? As we saw that formulation from Rabbi Leibowitz, it's people who are disqualified either because we think they're going to lie or because it says so. So if it's because it says so, it's not because we think they're going to lie. And you could even imagine reading the Gemara in Bava Batra this way. However, here's where it gets interesting. Yair Lorberbaum, scholar of rabbinic literature, has a 3-part essay about the Talmudic use of the term gzerat hakatuv, sort of surveying and reviewing all the appearances of the term gzerat hakatuv in rabbinic literature and trying to figure out how they get used. It also does some really productive work trying to compare to the Greco-Roman legal language that would have been familiar to the rabbis, as well as trying to understand how rabbis in the medieval period might have come to interpret pieces of rabbinic literature. There's like a lot there. Definitely read the 3 parts of 2 concepts of Gzera Ketuf if you have the opportunity. At least 2 chapters of which are in English, but it's all published in Hebrew. I think at least some of it is in English. Anyway, here's the pull quote from that essay. The jurisprudential or halachic meaning of the term Gzera Ketuf is rooted in the basic lexical or philological meaning of the term, i.e., the commanding and coercive power of scripture, or hakatuv. In the jurisprudential sense, there is no obstacle to Gzera Ketuf having a rationale. Typically, in fact, it has a reason and purpose. The characterization of a given commandment or halacha as Gzerat HaKatuv in this sense is independent of its rationale. Rather, it is concerned with stating that the mitzvah is imperative and unconditional commandment of God that is rooted in his authority and power to impose obligations and prohibitions. Whereas it says, well, let's take all that jargon and make it a little more intelligible. Rabbi claims that Gzera Ketuf doesn't mean it has no rationale. It's a jurisprudential term. It's telling us something about the character of the rule, namely that its authority its application is unconditional. Right? There's no exceptions to it, and he addresses specifically our case, the question of the krovim, of the relatives. He writes as follows. Since the disqualification of relatives is founded on a strong presumption, rather than being without reason, even Moses and Aaron cannot testify for one another. In modern terminology, the claim would be that a relative's testimony is inadmissible. Once the rule has been established that a person may not testify for their relative, and that we relate to that rule as to a royal decree, namely, as to a set rule allowing for no exceptions, the court cannot accept testimony from any relative, even from Moses and Aaron. Here's what Rabbi wants to claim. The Gemara claims that the disqualification of relatives is a Gzerat HaKatuv, that doesn't mean that we thought that the disqualification of relatives was because relatives are often biased towards one another, or, as the Sefer Chinuch says, maybe against one another, but that relatives have certain biases towards one another. But then we see, well, what about Moshe and Aaron? They would never lie. It's a Gzerat HaKatuv. That doesn't mean the reason why relatives are disqualified has nothing to do with whether they're going to lie or not. What it means is that our concern about relatives is that they're going to lie. We can imagine cases in which some relatives won't lie, that we can trust them not to lie. But in order for the rule to work, we need to apply the rule across the board. We need to apply it in all circumstances without making exceptions, because if we start allowing for exceptions, we'll accidentally make the wrong exceptions, right? If every family member comes in and says, don't worry, you can trust me, well then at some point we're going to let every relative testify and someone's going to tell a lie. And so in order for this rule to work, we need to apply it across the board. That, says the Rambam, is the jurisprudential meaning of the term Gzerat HaKatuv. Whenever the Gemara claims that a rule is Gzerat HaKatuv, it doesn't mean it has no logic. It means it has a logic, but that we can't use the logic to craft exceptions to the rule. Rather, we need to apply the rule to all cases, even the cases where the logic may not feel as necessary, as present, because we need the rule. For the rule to work, we need to apply it across the board. That, I think, is a really important thing for us to think about, in as much as Wikipedia thinks that Gzerat HaKatuv, in its traditional meaning, its more common meaning, i.e. some parts of the Torah have no logic, is supposedly a basic foundational element of Orthodox theology. Again, according to Wikipedia, at least. And it's really striking to think that, I know I've experienced this myself in yeshiva learning in various places, where this is a presumption. Gzerat HaKatuv means sometimes the Torah just says what it says and we just go with it. And it doesn't make sense and we shouldn't expect it to. And turns out, claims Rambam, if we do a really careful reading of rabbinic literature, that's just not what it ever meant. We're saying something about how we apply rules, not whether the rules make any sense. There's a great example of this that we saw in our learning this week. We saw the Mishnah in the 2nd chapter about the king. And we saw that the king is not supposed to have too many wives. Right? And this is the language of the Mishnah. Lo yarbelu nashim Ela Shmona Esrei. Okay, apparently the number is 18. How they get that from? Guess how they got the number 18? Who did they learn that from? That's right, David HaMelech. Well, sort of. David HaMelech, I think it's 6 wives, and they multiply by 3. Don't worry about it too much, but it just highlights that the rabbis do think very highly of David HaMelech. I think he's a good source of evidence for how a king should comport themselves. Continuing in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Marbeh Hulo Uvad Shelo Yehu Misirot Tzat Libo. Rabbi Yehuda says, honestly, he can have as many as he wants to, as many wives as he wants to, as long as they're not going to lead his heart astray. Right? The language in the Torah is V'lo yarvelo nashim v'lo yasur levavo. Right? The king can't have too many wives lest his heart be brought astray. Good question. What exactly you mean by the heart being led astray? Is it just distraction from his responsibilities, or imagine a world in which marriage to the king has to do with political alliances and where his loyalties will be? But there's some concern about too many wives leading to some sort of result of the heart being led astray. So Rabbi Yehuda says, have as many wives as you want to, just be careful. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon responds to Rabbi Yehuda. Afilu achat u'mesira at libo harei ze lo yisana. If there's a spouse who's going to lead the heart of the king astray, then even that one is a problem. Im kain, says Rabbi Shimon, lama ne'amar lo yarbelu nashim. Why does it say in the Torah, don't have too many wives? If any wife that's going to be problematic, distract the heart of the king. If even one is a problem, why does the Torah say don't have too many? Says Rabbi Shimon, da'afilu ka'avigail. Even one like Avigail, wife of David. Rabbi Shimon claims that when it comes to the definition of the rule of how many wives a king can have, yeah, the Torah says the reason why we need to be careful about the king having too many wives is lest his heart be led astray. But we can't trust the king to decide which wives are okay and which ones aren't. And so even a wife who is righteous like Abigail, there still needs to be a constraint on how many spouses, how many partners the king can have, lest his heart be led astray. Meaning, it's not that when we say that even a wife who won't lead his heart astray is forbidden, right? Even one like Abigail is forbidden if there are too many. Essentially, what Rabbi Shimon is saying is there are some rules that in order for them to work, we need to apply them across the board. We can't be making exceptions on the basis of the logic of the rule, because we don't trust the people at hand to make responsible decisions. This is, though the term Gzera Ketuv is not used in this sugya, it's a great analog, I think, to what we're imagining here. Right? There are some rules that in order for them to work, need to apply in all cases, even in the cases where the underlying logic of the rule doesn't seem to apply, because we need to apply the rule across the board. The reason why I cared to share this element of the mishnayot in this shiur is because there really is something very fundamental here about, do we think that the Torah has elements that are fundamentally beyond our understanding or not? And yet the Torah seems to claim that the Torah, is meant to be understood and accessible and even wise, which means it has to at least be intelligible. There's this language from the Ibn Ezra in his theological work, Yesod Morah, based on these psukim from Dvarim that you see on the left side of the screen, where the Ibn Ezra writes, our master Moses, peace be upon him, said regarding all the commandments, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. And if these commandments did not have reasons that we could understand their goodness, how could the nation say that these statutes are righteous and we who observe them are wise? It says the Ibn Ezra, the Torah claims that people around the world look at the Torah and say, wow, what a great way to govern. What a great way to live a life. It says to Ibn Ezra, if there are parts of the Torah that by definition are beyond our comprehension, are entirely lacking in logic or reason, then how could anyone look up to that? How can anyone say, oh, that's smart, if it doesn't make any sense? The Ibn Ezra is making this claim sort of broadly around his theology, that it must be that all elements of the Torah are in some way intelligible, even if it takes some work to figure out what that is. And so the sort of common Wikipedia version of Gzera Ketuv really lies at odds with, says Laura Baum, the right way to read rabbinic literature, and lies at odds with, per the Ibn Ezra, how we ought to think theologically about the Torah itself. And so hiding in the midst of our mishnayot about psulei idud, about disqualifications from testimony, we actually have something very deep happening here about the question of how do we determine the reasons, the logic behind the rules of the Torah, and should we expect to always find them? Before we just take a minute to talk about what's coming up next, thoughts, questions, concerns on what we see in the latter half of our shiur.
All quiet in chat.
Yes, that's well, I'm trying to see who's speaking. Actually, I'm gonna stop share for a moment. Yes, Monique, was that you?
I think there were two people, me and somebody else.
Go
So-
ahead, and we'll go to who's next.
No, I was just thinking about Yeshayahu Leibovitz, and I was trying to place him there.
Leibowitz. So we're on to level playing field, right? Yeshaya Leibowitz, 20th century Jewish theologian who is beholden to this sort of categorical imperative framing to how we think about the Torah, meaning sort of based on Kant, where what makes the Torah binding is just the fact that the Torah said it, and nothing about our relationship with Torah should depend on our understanding of the reasons for the Torah. Leibowitz is sort of, again, the opposite of what, say, the Ibn Ezra is saying. The Ibn Ezra is saying what makes Torah great is that it makes so much sense. And what Leibowitz says is we just do the Torah because it is the Torah. What I would say is Leibowitz is at odds with Ibn Ezra. Right? There's just two different theological approaches, and so for Leibowitz, the more traditional Redim Tzedakah Ketub would work much better. I think it's fair to say that Leibowitz is the exception rather than the rule within Jewish theology. He's fairly extreme in his approach, and is sort of unique or even idiosyncratic in his approach, which doesn't make him wrong. It just makes him at odds with a lot of earlier Jewish thinking. But the reason I think why Leibowitz would matter here is there are reasons to wonder whether we should think of certain elements of our religious tradition as beyond our comprehension, as they're just rules because God has the authority to say so and say nothing more. There is some value to that, and at the same time, there's also something appealing about when God speaks to us, God speaks from a voice of wisdom. It's not just random. It's not arbitrary. There are theological and spiritual and moral implications to thinking of the Torah as arbitrary and thinking of the Torah as reasoned. And then we have to sort of make sense of which of those sort of speaks to us more. Yeah. Okay, so coming up, this coming week, we're going to be looking at chapters 4, 5, and 6. It's a lot of prakim, but just because there aren't so many mishnayot, though some of the mishnayot are a little bit long, so budget the time accordingly. And really the focus over the chapters 4, 5, and 6 is about the death penalty. All the thinking about in our tradition around the death penalty happens here. Chapter 4 is primarily about how capital cases, right, dinei nefashot, work, meaning procedurally, and differentiating between dinei mamona and dinei nefashot, monetary cases and what we will call capital cases, as well as an extensive reflection on, or extensive presentation of how the witnesses are forewarned against lying, and we're going to take the time next week to really get a good look at that. There's some interesting things happen there. Be on the lookout at the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 is about the process of questioning and deliberating, and then chapter 6 is this interesting, poignant description of what it looks like when someone will be executed by the Beit Din, specifically with the punishment of stoning. And so, yeah, there's a lot to, as you're looking through these mishnayot in chapters 4, 5, and 6, be attentive to, I would say, 4 sort of lenses. Think about the procedural questions of how exactly would it work? Like what would really happen? And is the Mishnah really trying to describe things that actually happen? What's happening theologically? What are the presumptions made about God in this context of dinei nefashot? Ethically, how do we feel about the right and wrong about how people are treated here in the system? And finally, there is an emotional lens here too about what we presume are the feelings of the people involved in an execution, and what are the Mishnah's presumptions about people's feelings, what they should be, what they can be, and so on. So procedural, theological, ethical, and emotional lenses should sort of all be in the back of your mind as you're going through the Mishnah learning this coming week. And thanks everybody for joining us yet again this week. And you should enjoy the rest of your Chanukah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. if you have questions that you want to pass along to Rabbi Nitzanim, you can reach out at
Absolutely.
inquiry@drisha.org. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next week. Take care.
Everybody, happy Hanukkah.